It is May the 5th, and this is Vlad for rarefoundation.com, and we're with Scott Ventureyra, and we're going to discuss this new book, which actually, I got to say, I haven't read it all yet, but what I saw was really interesting, and more important, I think it is actually a very important book. So, Scott, can we just start with this? Initially, you go into the main theme of your book, which is obviously COVID, as the title implies, right? And but I'd like you to talk a little bit about who you are and your background and why you felt this book needed to be written.
So I'll go through my academic background first. So initially I got a Bachelor of Arts from Carleton, and then I did another Bachelor of Social Sciences and specialized in economics at the University of Ottawa. And then from there I decided to study theology and philosophy. And so my degrees are actually in theology, but they're heavily focused in philosophical theology. And my specialty is the interaction between science and religion, and using philosophy as kind of a bridge between the two. And so that's my main specialty. And in terms of COVID, the reason I got involved in this is because I saw how they were deceiving people, the media, the government, all the health organizations around the world. And people were basically being manipulated into believing that this was actually a threat to their health. I know people that have actually gotten COVID, and some of them are contributors to the 2 books that I've written. And so it is a real thing. It is a serious threat. Some people think it's a bioweapon. Other people think it's actually SARS-CoV-2. I'm open for persuasion on either side. I know there's a threat, but the way that they actually carried this forth did not justify any of the measures. And so for me, early on, I was quite disturbed by all this. Maybe for the first day, I was a little bit leery. With a friend, we were reading a publication about how SARS-CoV-2, the virus, could be transmitted through metallic objects and that it would stay there for several hours. But this, in and of itself, was not actually accurate. And then the narrative shifted to it being transferable through aerosol or droplets. And so the narrative kept shifting. You listen to Fauci, you listen to Theresa Tam, Dr. Kieran Moore, flip-flop. So I knew there was something wrong with the whole narrative. And so I wrote a publication in late April. First, I published it on my blog. It was actually a response.
What's the name of your blog? Sorry.
So yeah, it's scottventureyra.com. That's the website. And so the blog was just, I actually initiated it when I started thinking heavily upon the COVID situation. So prior to that, I didn't have a blog. I just had posted a lot of my academic articles. Personally, I never wanted to get involved in this battle. I'm more interested in, thinking about philosophy of mind, science and religion, science and theology, as opposed to getting into something that's very, very dirty. And but I felt that I was called to do it. I felt there was an obligation. So I proceeded in writing this article because it was actually an article trying to promote feminism in a very strange way, saying that women actually were more effective at responding to COVID-19 than men. So this author who writes for Forbes is a feminist activist. Never heard of her before. I think her name is Aviva Cox. And so I wrote a response. Initially, I had sent it to a magazine called Catholic Insight, and the editor has similar views to myself, but he was a bit hesitant, and he sat on it for a week, so I published it, 3rd week of April on my blog. And so I tackled the whole idea whether men or women are being better at responding to this crisis. And I found that a lot of the so-called evidence she presented was wanting. And then I also got into the hydroxychloroquine issue in that article. So that really woke me up with retractions that were happening through many of the scientific and medical journals. And a lot of the studies were fraudulent when it came to hydroxychloroquine. And I started reading on Didier Rouault and Vladimir Zelenko. And I saw how these doctors were being persecuted. And Didier Rouault is one of the most renowned microbiologists in the world, most one of the best published, microbiologists on the globe. But they were coming after him for being a so-called conspiracy theorist. And as soon as I saw things like this, it just solidified my view more and more that there was something definitely wrong with this narrative. And so in this response, I got into details of hydroxychloroquine and how it had to be taken with certain doses of azithromycin and zinc. But it was very precise the way that Vladimir Zelenko went about it. And in New York State, he treated at the time about 1,950 patients with a 99.5% recovery rate. I think maybe 2 people had died, but we don't know the full causes of that. So it was highly effective, but the media was bent on destroying this treatment because it's not related to the vaccine rollout. So I realized that, and I had mentioned Donald Trump that he was promoting this, and they were demonizing him as usual. And so I thought, well, maybe there's something to this hydroxychloroquine. And a lot of the studies that I read were not taking into account the amount of time that was required for the treatment and at what stage it was supposed to be administered, and the doses of hydroxychloroquine and the zinc and azithromycin. So that was something that really got my attention. So early on, I became very skeptical, and I saw interviews with David Icke that actually, and how that was being censored, which really woke me up. And I started to think, well, why are they censoring something? But why? Science is about debate, medicine is about debate. Throughout scientific and medical history, people were wrong. Scientists were wrong more often than they were right. And so science is a work in progress. And the most basic level is studying the natural world through the 5 senses. And so once you break that down and you listen to this pure propaganda, like follow the science, trust the science, this is nothing more than propaganda. It has nothing to do with science. Science is about debate. It's about dissent. You want dissenting voices because the science gets better.
It's
and
about
medicine
falsifying.
gets better.
It's about falsifying hypotheses.
That's right. There's the element of falsifiability that Karl Popper identified. And I studied a bit of his student, Emmer Lakatos. He didn't completely agree on the falsification issue, but he said, there's elements where it leads to a shift in consciousness within the scientific theory, so then it must be augmented or elements discarded. He called them problem shifts. There was positive and negative ones. And I think understanding his thought and Karl Popper's thought would be very useful to understanding the COVID-19 situation when it comes to stifling medical doctors and scientists that have a differing view. And I was also disturbed by the responses of Anthony Fauci and Dr. Francis Collins. I had a lot of respect for Francis Collins. I'm a Catholic, he's evangelical Christian, and I really admired his work with the language of God, and I thought he was one of the best working scientists in the world. But then what happened was I started reading some of the private exchanges that he had with other doctors, including Fauci, and he began to actually say that some of these scientists that were dissenting, that actually signed the Barrington Declaration that was completely against these draconian measures and the extreme lockdown measures, he called them fringe epidemiologists. What gave him that impression, and why would he do that? He's hiding something. And it was refuted, I think, perhaps in the Washington Post. And this is not a peer-reviewed journal, so it was just basically a hit piece. I think that Rochelle Walensky was involved in it and several other scientists. And what happened was they didn't really look at the evidence. They just discarded them as fringe epidemiologists. Well, that's a strange statement to make when these scientists, they're at Oxford, Harvard, and Yale. Hardly fringe. And in the book I say, yeah, fringe for denying the false narrative of the pseudo-pandemic. So, and then on and on and on, all the censorship on Facebook, on Twitter, it was just remarkable. And so every day, my views became more solidified, and I thought to myself, wow, this is like the biggest psychological and biological experiment ever foisted upon on humans. It was just unbelievable to me. But yet here we were, and most people were blind to it.
So in your book, you mentioned that early on Christian circles thought your views on the zeitgeist, on the whole view, on your whole view of this pseudo-reality that's been imposed on us all, or the pseudo-reality itself, were crazy. And now many Christian denominations and churches seem to be the most aware of what's taking place. And I say that, with a great deal of satisfaction, actually. At least we saw that in the Freedom Convoy and in the counter-narrative websites. There's very heavy Christian elements, and they seem to be on the vanguard of the sort of awakening to the pseudo-reality that's been imposed through COVID and through other means too, frankly. Why do you think that is?
Well, that there's been a large awakening among Christians themselves that weren't before.
Yes.
So, in a sense, I agree there is a segment that has been awakening, but then I would disagree that it's significant numbers because, I don't know the statistics behind it, but I do see, I agree with you, there is a movement within Christian circles and some Catholic circles and maybe Orthodox circles. But, when I attend the church that I grew up going to, everybody's still wearing a mask. Sunday morning, there's maybe 3 people that aren't wearing masks. My daughter included is wearing a mask. So I see these people as still asleep in their slumber. And so I have met good Christians that have questioned this narrative and they have woken up. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And when it comes to this issue, I think that 30% of the population, the split between the 30 that agree with the narrative and then the 30 that are like us, like-minded, that completely disagree with this false narrative. And then there's a 40% that I think is what's going to reach the critical mass. So we need probably, something close to 75% of those, so 30 plus 30, 60%. Then maybe we can start making some changes. But until then, if we're still at the 30, 40%, it's still difficult because, the way that totalitarian regimes throughout history have taken over is basically through appeasement. People get on their knees and they comply. And it's interesting, this whole issue of compliance, because early on, and I believe that our mutual friend pointed you to my blog that I had written, Won't Be Fooled Again by the Who, or Don't Get Fooled Again by the Who.
Such a good name.
Such a good name, such a good song, right? And so the WHO was gaslighting people, and all these health organizations were basically bringing us to our knees to what I called unthinking compliance. There's also the thinking compliance, which I think the 40% clearly illustrate. And I've been guilty to a certain extent of the compliance. When I go into certain stores, I'll wear the mask and I'll abide by, the following the arrows to a certain extent, and then the little social distancing, which is basically oxymoronic. It doesn't make any sense. There's nothing social about distancing between people. Not that I like somebody hovering around me, but yet there I was. I knew what was happening, but I still did it because I didn't want any trouble. I'm Canadian. I'm a polite guy. I don't want any trouble with people. But then when it came to certain measures, I did have to take a stand. When it came to this illegal injection and other things, and so anyways, it was a snowball effect. And to get back to the question about Christians and waking up, there is a segment, but there's still a lot of work. There's a lot of them that are even worse off than some secular friends. So the strange thing is, I found affinity with some Muslim friends, some agnostic, Jewish, people that are not part of the same faith as me, but they can see this because there's a spiritual awakening. So I would focus more on the spiritual aspect, because some of us are being called to act upon this because of the spiritual dimension, regardless of our faiths. Even though I think, even the Christians that are being misled, and we agree on the resurrection of Christ, we agree on fundamentals, but then when it comes to this fundamental issue, we still have this profound disagreement. Even somebody that helped me come back to my faith, who was the father of an ex-girlfriend, He had a background in physics and a master's in theology, and he got me fascinated in the question of theology and science. And so this is one of the reasons I went back to school. And it was also one of the reasons that I went back to my faith, and I thank him in my first book on the origin of consciousness, which just focuses on consciousness. And so when he is more distraught about the division, which it's understandable, the division among the Christian brethren, but to me he should be focusing on the unification on the truth. Unification of the truth, and that's what he's shifted to being more focused on. Well, let's bring all of us together, whether it's like they abide by the gender ideology and this and that. He's right that there is a satanic element that's dividing us, absolutely. But we should try to unify through the truth. So we shouldn't back down because we're afraid of what others may think of us. We shouldn't back down because certain Christians may disagree with us. We have to be able to discuss this, and people are shunning the discussion, and that's what's fueling this chaos.
Absolutely. You know, we could, on many of these points, like we could do an hour on many of these points individually, but there's an element of this which I'm very excited to get to. So I'm going to plow forward here. Can you go into what is called mass formation psychosis a little bit more than you did? I know that one of the creators of mRNA, Dr. Robert Malone, he made that phrase really famous, and I kind of waffle on it a bit because there's mass formation psychosis, his term, and there's what I see taking place, which is a Maoist mass line formation,
Okay.
which are subtly different but importantly different. And I was just wondering, in your book you talk about mass formation psychosis.
Right.
Could you go into that a bit and why you brought it up in your book?
Sure. So initially, like I had mentioned on my blog, I had coined the term unthinking compliance. And it fits very nicely with this mass formation psychosis. And so later on, much significantly later, so probably a year after that blog, which was written in June 2020, I had come across Matthias Desmet's work. And it was with an interview with Rainer Fuellmich. And so he started talking about this mass formation psychosis, and Matthias Desmet is a psychologist in Belgium. And he had done a lot of work on totalitarian regimes and throughout Europe. And so how these regimes, these governments, gained the compliance of people. So it's a psychological attack. And so what happened in the particular case of COVID-19, they basically created this free-floating anxiety that nobody can really pinpoint. They want to blame others, the government. Everybody's locked down in isolation. We can communicate through media platforms in the digitized world, but we were all told to basically isolate. And so that's how it becomes easier to create this mass formation psychosis. And so with this mass formation psychosis, what had happened is that people were so ready to get back to the normal, which they called the new normal. They became so anxious that they started to accept whatever narrative that would unfold. And basically, the idea that Matthias Desmet has is that basically it's like a hypnosis. So this hypnosis occurred, and so people started to just basically, they're begging for this to be over. And once they get to that stage, they'll accept anything, no matter how absurd it is, how ludicrous it could be. And so that's why everybody thought, well, here comes the vaccine. And I also get into that in the book about how COVID, in a sense, became a religion. And so the whole COVID narrative is like they're begging. So it's like the equivalent of the Eucharist in Christ for Catholics. It's the equivalent of the salvation through Jesus and all of Christianity is that Savior, the COVID-19 vaccine. And so that is what Matthias Desmet, and I agree with them, is what basically made people think, well, this is the way we can get out of this thing that they created themselves. And my title is related to that. So people ask me, it's like, well, why did I label it COVID-19 a dystopian delusion? Well, it's because it's not a delusion, the machinations of the health organizations and the governments and the globalist elites. That is not a fabrication. That's not a delusion. What's the delusion is that this virus is an existential threat to the world. That's the delusion, and that's what I meant by in my book, and it ties into the mass formation psychosis. So just one final point, but even deeper than that, in the preface I get into the fact that this, au fond, right at the bottom of everything, this is a satanic attack, and it's a spiritual attack. And so maybe my agnostic and atheist friends that may be awakened to the COVID-19 narrative being a pseudo-pandemic, they have to understand that this has a deep spiritual element. And to also go back to the person that got me back into my Christian beliefs, there is that element of division. That's part of the spiritual attack. There's part of it is the doubt. You start to, some people, and I've included myself, sometimes I start to gaslight myself because I start to wonder, well, how can the majority be wrong? Or the people that are complying, how could it be that way? And it's interesting that relates to something else we can maybe discuss later, and it's tied into this mass formation psychosis. It's a conformity experiment that was actually carried forward by Solomon Aschel, who was a Polish social psychologist who came up with this experiment, and I looked into briefly 4 variations of it, which is kind of interesting, but we can maybe discuss that later.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of value in that. In fact, the entire satanic element of it I think, can be explained very rationally too, and that's, I don't think it's that difficult to get across to atheists or non-spiritual people, in a sense, because if Satanism is a set of attributes, and those attributes are at play, it's satanic irrespective of any supernaturalism.
Right.
That's another discussion. But I think it's interesting.
Right. Well, the distinction is also between, there's elements that are spiritually satanic, and then there's also the Anthony LaVey Satanism, right, which is more, at least the way he portrayed it himself and other Satanists, is that it is kind of devoid of the spirituality. Probably they're being disingenuous about that, but they would try to make it into kind of, a materialistic religion, which is basically based on selfishness. Me, myself, and I. So what I call the unholy trinity.
Oh, interesting. Actually, where we're going next, I think, might be the real tie-in here. Because what really actually excited me, even for the small amount of the book that I've managed to get to, is the connection between covert measures and hardcore communist and classical communist thought. You bring that up early in the book, and it would be great if you could spend a little time helping us to understand that connection.
Yeah, so there's a deep connection with the implementation of these illegal and, unlawful lockdowns. So it's the sort of thing that you've seen in the past with these totalitarian regimes. And so my colleague Travis kind of gets into that in his first chapter. So when the Soviets had basically, the Marxists and the communists had declared, the Ukrainian farmers as a big threat. So they started cutting off their supplies and their means of production. And so they died of starvation. So it's not too dissimilar to what happened early on with the COVID-19 measures, in the sense that maybe it wasn't as in your face as an extreme, but they shut down countless businesses. So it was the rise, more of the rise of the corporation, and basically the shutdown of small businesses. So this actually ties into, the New World Order and the Great Reset. And so there's a connection between what is called stakeholder capitalism and what was happening. So they it's another word for me personally, global communism. So they're elevating certain elements of, this idea that the corporation must be elevated, and then also the government. So the two intertwined can gain control of the world more readily. And since there's no competition with the small businesses, if you wipe them out, people don't have many choices. So they have to be employed by some big corporation or government, and it's easier to survey people. And so this is what happened early on, and it ties directly with this one world governance and the Great Reset. And so absolutely, there is a deep connection with how these fascistic and communistic dictatorships have acted in the past. Nazi Germany is not any different. I think, the Soviets and the Nazis are, two separate sides of the same coin. I mean, both of them had, socialist ideologies imbibed,
And both of them had contempt for the individual as a thing.
Absolutely, and it was a contempt for Christianity.
Well, because Christianity is ultimately individualistic.
That's right.
Because the rights of the individual come from God, anyway.
But there's also the communal aspect that Catholics believe in, but it's not to elevate the socialistic angle with the communists, where they thought it's like we can rule over every person, and then it's like the individual ceases to exist because it's about the whatever they would call, it's like the common good, but there is no common good under communistic regimes. So yeah, absolutely, there is a deep connection between these totalitarian regimes of the past and what we're seeing with the Great Reset right now.
So I just want to drill down a little bit on that. Can you detail, because you actually used, I have to say, when I saw it, I love seeing it, but could you detail what the word kulaks are, which I saw in your book, and how the Leninist policies and concepts, kulak is a Leninist policy, relate to what is taking place today? Right.
So with the kulak policy, so from my understanding of it, is that basically they wanted to destroy any means of production that was held individualistically by the farmers, and then they were considered enemies, and so they built resentment among the populace, and so they had the okay to go in and basically destroy these generational farming businesses as if they were bourgeoisie, when clearly they were just hardworking people that had accrued some substantial wealth maybe, but I mean, they weren't bourgeoisie by any stretch of the imagination. And so they wanted to control the land and the economics. And so basically they annihilated them. They starved them, they killed them, and they basically destroyed this segment of the economy so the government could take over. And like I said, there's deep parallels with what we're seeing now with these Leninist policies of the past. And so, and that's why Travis, he wrote the chapter, Lessons Lost to History, because here we go going down the same path. And when I had met Travis, the author of the first chapter, I found that one thing fascinating. For somebody like Jordan Peterson, who studied the psychology behind totalitarian regimes, was oblivious to what was happening. So I asked myself the question, was he actually oblivious? Is he controlled opposition? I'm not sure. But I found it fascinating at the time when I had met Travis. We were having a discussion. I said, well, he basically told me, he's like, well, Peterson did so much for me. He awoke me. And the reason that I know about what's going on in the world is because of him and reading him and watching his YouTube lectures. And I said, well, I invited him to write a chapter, and I had completed a lot of the book. And I said, well, why don't you write one of the chapters? And I wanted to include it first before my colleague Phil Fernandez chapter that gets into the Great Reset and connecting COVID-19. And so I said, well, let's draw the connection here. It's like, why is it that you realized this early on and he didn't? I have other friends that realized it as well. So he quotes them, and if we're going to be charitable, he was basically fooled, and he said, this is the deal, guys. I take the vaccines, you leave me the hell alone to do what I want. And he's like, silly me, I didn't realize, right? But
how could Jordan Peterson
not realize?
Possibly have spun that logic? I'm sorry, I don't buy it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why it's like, I'm sometimes skeptical as to whether he's a control opposition or not. I don't know. I like a lot of his work. I've written articles related to him. I've been a heavy critic of his when it comes to his ideas about God. I think he fundamentally has not done his research. He doesn't understand the arguments for God's existence. He seems open, I'm not sure. He doesn't like the question, and that's to me a little bit evasive. But when it comes to this issue, like you, I do question whether it is genuine, this lack of knowledge of what was transpiring right before his eyes, given that he has studied this through and through.
Yeah.
And then it's like suddenly, it's like conveniently around the trucker convoy, he starts to wake up. And same with the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre and all these people, Leslyn Lewis, and most of the Conservative Party started supporting the truckers convoy. But I see that as very similar to the Liberals and how they supported these draconian measures. But the Conservatives never even batted an eyelash for 2 years. They didn't say anything. And so they saw this as a political opportunity, nothing more. And
so that was the Canadian Conservative Party under O'Toole, though.
That was O'Toole, yes.
Who clearly was
liberal light.
Well, I think he's World Economic Forum, no less than. That's
right. Yeah, so he was basically a liberal in a blue coat. And I mean, if you see this guy, he's parading around in red heels, trying to appease things that are not conservative values. So
I think it's worth an honorable mention that Karl Marx and his main apostle, his most effective acolyte, Saul Alinsky, both dedicated their most important works to Satan. That Karl Marx was a Satanist for a decade or more before he wrote the Communist Manifesto. And that, of course, Saul Alinsky dedicated his key book, Rules for Radicals, to Satan. So that it adds a lot of momentum to the idea that Marxism is a Satanist effort or deeply connected to it. Do you have any thoughts on that as a doctor of
theology? Yeah. So I haven't delved too deeply into the connection between Karl Marx and Satanism, but I can recommend an excellent book that I have just gone over through the sources and read part of the introduction. It's a book by Paul Kengor. I believe the name is Karl Marx and the Devil. And so he really heavily documents all the connections and maybe private letters and all kinds of things that connect Karl Marx to Satanism. And Saul Alinsky, it's interesting that his son had a recent debate a few years back with Dinesh D'Souza, who's a conservative political pundit who's just released an interesting movie about the election fraud of the 2020 American elections.
The Trump card?
No, 2,000 Mules. It's a new one.
2,000 Mules, okay.
2,000 Mules. Apparently they have 4.3 million minutes of fraudulent footage. So some forensic specialist is saying that this is a done deal once the evidence comes out. But to go back to the point about the connection between Marxism and Satanism, and definitely Saul Alinsky dedicated his one of his books to Lucifer, and Dinesh D'Souza was quick to point that out in the debate, and his son was appalled by it. He said, "Oh, my father's not here to defend himself," but at the same time, he tries to spin it off as something more innocent that had nothing to do with any satanic figure or biblical figure. So there is that connection, but I haven't really delved into it. Interestingly, it's also worth a mention that, Saul Alinsky mentored Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama as well. So there's another connection to the deep state as well.
Absolutely. Do you have any societal prognosis? I mean, obviously you've got a good grip on what I would phrase as being the imposed pseudo-reality. Actually, I'm channeling Stephen Coughlin, but the imposed pseudo-reality, which COVID and a bunch of other lines of effort as well, not just COVID. It's the exact same people that pushed the religion of peace and pushed the war in Ukraine as being absolutely one-sided and so on and so on. So what would you say what's your prognosis for society going forward in terms of what it's going to lead us to?
Right. So I think, we're at a certain precipice right now, and it is crucial that people start to wake up. I'm a bit disheartened from what I see, but I was inspired by the trucker movement, for instance. I was inspired by, the movements across the world that were ignited by the trucker convoy in Canada. I was actually proud to be Canadian again. It's been a while, but that movement was, it was inspiring, and it even got the attention of Archbishop Maria Vignano, and Carlos Vignano, and he wrote a nice commentary on it, and he gave a nice little speech about it. And so there is some inspirational elements, Rolling Thunder this past weekend. There are true patriots that are speaking out. There is a good movement, but I fear that it's just not enough. And I see this period right now in the spring, summer is kind of a breathing room, and maybe it's a way to collect ourselves and plan for the future, because I see what's next is more vaccine rollout, digital implementation of digital ID, the credit score system, the social credit score system coming eventually.
And possibly digital currency.
Digital currency. I myself am in favor of decentralized digital currencies. But
digital currency is not decentralized.
Well,
you're thinking of cryptocurrency.
Crypto, decentralized cryptocurrencies. So the digital currencies that every nation has, or the ones that they want to centralize, I'm against that, obviously. But the decentralized ones like Bitcoin, and the thing is, I had drawn an interest in the last couple of years to XRP, but much to my dismay, I found out that they're part of the WEF, Brian Garlinghouse. So there are some cryptos that they're a way that you can counteract inflation and this constant ludicrous printing of money. So there's a way to counteract that with buying precious metals and getting involved with the decentralized crypto world. So I see that we can combat this, in a financial way, and we can combat it through awakening others. But I'm still disheartened by the fact that so many people are in their slumber. When I look at social media and I look at many different avenues, or people that, wearing their masks everywhere, even though there are no restrictions. And when I go to church, everybody's still wearing a mask. So it's very disappointing to see that. But, in an ideal world, I'd like to see a great takeover where we the people take back our power, and we held everybody that's been part of this coup d'etat responsible for their actions, regardless of whether they're politicians, economists, journalists, medical doctors, political science professors. I mean, they're all, at the end of the
grade school teachers, high school teachers.
Absolutely. I talk about that in the book. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is to produce kind of a historical witness to what was going on. And sometimes I'm asked what's unique about the book. Well, I think one of the elements that's unique is that it's such a tightly knit package that contains so much information. It basically goes through everything. I mean, there's books that are written about certain aspects. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. just wrote a book on the real Anthony Fauci, so he focuses on Fauci. I have elements of Fauci in there related to many things. I even relate him to the late Kerry Mullis, who was the inventor of the PCR test, and his comments about him are really alarming and eye-opening that I would encourage people to look him up, and I have the references in the videos. And so, I'm hopeful that maybe there could be this great takeover through this great awakening. But at the moment, I see them constantly rolling out their plan without any consequence. But if we could have accountability, like Reiner Fuellmich thinks that this is going to be coming soon, I don't know, but I'm hopeful, and I'm still fighting for that to happen. But the accountability, it'll have to come sooner or later. Eventually, it'll have to come, and everybody, all the media personalities, they're guilty of crimes against humanity.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a good place to stop for the moment. I'm hoping we're going to do this again. I can't thank you enough. This is great, and I hope a lot of people read your book. It's beautifully written, and it's an important document from what I've been able to see so far. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. It was an honor.
This exclusive interview is brought to you by rarefoundation.com.